last meeting came to you and basically laid out steps that we were going to take to start looking at these housing issues. And you addressed the first one tonight, which was, allowing multifamily in the Commerce District itself. We really have to buckle down and take a look at underlying density patterns, parking issues. There's a lot that we have to talk about to really change things to make housing possible. There's really only a couple of opportunities that we have in this community to do that, one of which is the rural district, which Mary will give you some information on, and the other is in our original downtown residential districts. One of the easiest ways to create new opportunities is to change the underlying density factors in high density and medium density and low density to allow additional units from the original pattern. My conversations with Taylor, by the way, shows that at least in the first instance, they want to fund smaller projects rather than big projects. And by the way, they're not funding projects like from the ground up to build them. They're funding gaps and things like that. They clearly, at least Taylor does, wants to see programs that would add 1 or 2 units to some of our original Victorian stock, things like that, which is really coincidental to what we've been talking about at the staff level when we're talking about density, right? Mary and staff have been working on creating an RFQ or an RFP? Is it RFP? RFP. To actually hire a consultant to work with some of this underlying patterns, make some recommendations, while at the same time we have staff looking at the actual utilization of the properties themselves, how many properties are actually out of sync with the underlying zoning code, which is surprisingly a large amount. So we're going to be prepared, I think, pretty quickly to move on some recommendations in high density, medium density, transition districts, et cetera. The other area that we wanted to concentrate on was the rural district. And the rural district right now requires a 5-acre minimum lot. And that was put in place in the 70s, if I recall right. And that was due to what was perceived as a very rapid growth occurring at that time. And people who were here when they did that have told me that was only supposed to be a temporary break. It was not supposed to be permanent, but yet here it is 50 years later and we're talking about it. So we want to take a look at those districts to see what opportunities that we can make inside the district standards, as well as what we can do to what we always call cluster housing, but to change some of the cluster rules and regulations. So that is the broad scope or the broad sweep of what we're trying to do. We're also trying to do it as quickly as possible so that whenever possible, we can take advantage of some of the state funding that could help make some of these dreams come true. And with that, I'll answer any questions about the broader scope.
Mayor Hansel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Med, what are you hearing from developers? Like, what are the most common things that are preventing developers from putting in a new building or a new development now?
Multifamily, it's lack of available land. And lack of available land is probably going to be the rural district and the 5-acre requirement, and being unable to aggregate that to make it possible to build like townhouse buildings or multifamily buildings and things like that. When it comes to existing stock, the 2 areas that I hear, and not only in Keene but around the state, is the sprinkler requirement on the 3rd unit. It's devastating to a lot of these efforts, and in our case, but could be also the availability of parking. Clearly, we're going to have to create some sort of parking program for on-street parking to make some of that work. And I'm trying to work with the sprinkler requirement at the state level.
Matt, do we have something in place right now for on-street parking?
There's a couple of programs. They're very limited. I arm wrestle the city attorney on this all the time in trying to get as much freedom in the parking management system as we can without having to come to the city council to do everything. So we're going to have to figure out a ground on that. There's a residential parking district process It requires, as it's written now, the residents of that street to petition the city council to allow it. And then the city council agrees or doesn't agree. There's also a less than 90-day process, but once again, it's on designated streets. Ideally, we would work out a system. There's a program called Parking Benefits District, which I outlined in the strategic parking plan. And what you do is it's very similar to how we do our downtown parking in some ways. The people who would be in that district would be able to park in that district. Some of the money that is collected in that district then goes back into the streetscape, maybe landscaping, things like that. So it's a regular program. It's very similar to what Portsmouth is doing in some of their neighborhoods right now. So, that's coming attractions of some things I want to propose to the council, probably coincidentally with the budget. I'm not quite sure on timing yet. But clearly, if we're going to unlock this, we're going to have to think a little bit more creatively rather than 1940-ish.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I think you're taking a lot of the words right out of my mouth in a lot of these instances. I mean, we at PLD had a conversation about parklets, and I turned to the attorney and I said, this is going to go sideways, but at some point we're going to have a conversation about parking through the winter and the parking ban, and what what opportunities the city has to have residential parking on the streets, and how other cities are doing that and managing it successfully. And I think you've brought up several ways of maybe accomplishing that. And I think that what you've brought before us with the rural district really starts, along with the commerce that we just talked about, really starts to address some of the council's big housing goals. We've talked a lot at City Council about wanting to create affordable housing, wanting to create, homelessness opportunities, wanting to create workforce housing, and there's housing opportunities and need in this city, in this community, at many different levels. We saw a project at our last joint committee where the gentleman who brought it before us, we had a lot of conversation about wells and septic systems. And I think when you're in the rural district, one of the big limitations is being able to safely have a well and a septic system. And I don't believe you need 5 acres to do that. And I think that when I saw this coming before us and I took a look at what our map looks like, we have so many lots in our rural district that are less than 5 acres and are non-conforming now. I know we don't have any visuals with us, but I think it might be helpful to have that at some point.
Well, I think Mary will address some of that in a minute.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Okay.
You're absolutely correct. And, I have had this discussion with the Public Works Director already. And, clearly a change like that is going to have some comfort level. You're going to have to be very diligent in providing information to people so they understand what the rules are, whatever the rules end up to be. But as it sits right now during the summer, there's 2 nights a week, I believe, that you can't park overnight in the downtown, so that there's an opportunity to clean. The whole downtown is shut down in theory because of that. And then in the wintertime, you have the winter ban. Most places around the country have no problem with working with that. It takes a little bit of work on our part. People that park on the street as part of this program, and you make it part of the program, will have to realize that there's times when you got to move your vehicle so we can plow. We're all grown-ups. We can handle it.
Matt, I just have one more question, because you had spoken to Taylor Caswell, and as you know, the governor's first plan was flat out denied. So they came forward with this new plan, and the reason the first plan was denied was because there was no affordable housing listed in his plan. And so when it came back this time, there is affordable housing in that plan. Did he give you any information on what the ideas were to obtain money or apply for money for affordable housing?
There is no real setup yet. They have to work out. I know that it is intended that the projects actually go back to the governor and council for approval. I did listen in on Taylor's roasting, quite frankly. And, you know, and it really was a discussion about affordable housing and what it meant and whatnot. And he was actually correct in what he was saying, which is the definition of affordable housing is going to change depending on where you are, right? It's kind of standard. So what he did was he amended his original report to the governor and council, and it kind of threw me for a loop because I couldn't find this additional information until I realized that's what he did. But in it, and I'd be happy to send both groups a copy of
I think it would be helpful for all of us to have that,
Yep.
because in the second plan that he submitted, there was information in there
Yep.
about something that I've been talking about for quite some time, and I'm not just the only one on the block that's talking about that, and that is when you're doing new construction, that 10 to 20% of the apartments in that building will be for affordable housing.
Yeah. So there's a lot of definitional challenges that the state needs to work out on what they mean by low income, affordable, workforce, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that is included in the packet is some tabular information right down to the 100% of HUD and 80% of HUD and things like that, which I think will be helpful in our discussions as we go forward.
I agree.
Clearly, housing that we can attract young families or older retirees like me someday to be able to live in Keene and work in Keene, et cetera, is important. But I do know that I'm hearing from a lot of our major employees the alarm bells.
We're in crisis.
We are.
We've been in crisis mode for quite some time.
We
and
have.
it's peaking.
We have, and I think right now we're taking the correct steps to try to figure out what to do about that and grapple. I think, by the way, we're ahead of most of the state in this, if you want to know the truth.
We
Maybe
are.
they can learn from us a little bit.
We are.
Okay.
Thank you.
You want to talk about rural? You wanted me to warm them up. I did.
Thanks. Madam Chair, I just have, I don't really have anything prepared for you tonight. Staff have been doing research into the rural district and into the conservation residential development subdivision option, which is the City of Keene's cluster development option. And just taking a look, right now, we're still doing research and we're still examining the rural district, but our initial research was pretty telling. Just to give you some of the statistics, there's total of 1,118 parcels. About just over 56% of them are non-conforming with respect to lot size. So over 56% of the parcels in the rural district are less than the 5-acre minimum. And part of that is because historically the minimum lot size in what we now call our rural district was 2 acres, and that was changed, as Med mentioned, in sometime around like 1976?
78, I believe.
78, okay.
I believe it's 78.
It was the 1970s. And again, that was changed because at the time, the city was seeing pretty intense development pressure. We had an option called planned unit development back then that we no longer have, which was allowing much more dense housing development to occur than even the underlying zoning at the time permitted. So there are a lot of lots in the rural districts that are non-conforming. Even if we were to reduce the lot size back down to 2 acres, there would still be over a third of the parcels, 35.4%, would still be non-conforming. And that goes back to all those planned unit developments that were done. So we're looking at lot sizes. We're also looking at the land itself that's in the rural district and using GIS and mapping, looking at where steep slopes are and prohibitive slopes, where wetlands are. We're also looking at the extent of the city sewer and city water and trying to kind of do our GIS technician, I forget the term that he uses, like a co-analysis, but just basically looking at the overlapping of all of those different factors and what opportunity there still is for development in the rural district. And at the same time, staff have been really looking at what other communities in New Hampshire and around the country are doing to help promote housing and looking at some of the ideas that were actually in the master plan from 2010 that we haven't ever really actively pursued. So in New Hampshire, you can do incentive zoning. So for just throwing some ideas out there, with our conservation residential development subdivision option, right now, you get a density bonus in return for putting land into conservation. So you permanently conserve at least 50% of your land. You can get a bit of a density bonus, and usually you get a little bit more flexibility in the housing type as well. So for example, in the rural, I believe you can do a duplex under the CRD option, whereas normally you can only do a single family. You could also build in additional incentives in there. So for example, if we were to come up with a mechanism to both track and enforce this, we could have a density bonus for making some of the units workforce housing. That isn't as simple as it seems on its face. There's a lot of issues with tracking and enforcement, and how do you manage that long term. So right now, that's kind of what we're spending most of our efforts on, is learning what are the lessons learned from other communities that have done that. We've reached out to New Hampshire Housing and a few other different organizations to hear about best practices. So we're currently researching different options that are out there that we could look at. But it's coming. We don't have any concrete proposals for you yet, but we are looking at the district as a whole and trying to be really thoughtful about what would make sense for the rural area, because it is mostly land that's outside of city services.
This cluster housing concept still anticipates a minimum lot size. It still anticipates a building on a lot. And one of the things I've been asking staff to do is consider the fact that when you have a fairly large parcel, the density ultimately is what matters, how many units you have on that big piece of property. And if it made sense from a construction standpoint, or the ability to provide water and sewer and things like that, for that to be a fourplex building or fiveplex building or a duplex building, we should build in that capability into the project instead of forcing them to put them on 1 acre lots or whatever the case may be right now. It's a very inefficient use of the land, and we've got to become much more efficient in how we use land if we're going to make this work.
The one thing I'll just add to all of this, I wanted to put this out there because it was a pretty great or pretty high number, but just doing a really basic analysis, which is probably an undercounting, 86.7% of the parcels in the rural district are owner occupied. And that's most likely an undercount, because the way that we did that analysis is we looked at the owner's mailing address and compared that to the address of the property. And so, any owner who lives in their own home but uses a P.O. box would have been counted as not owner occupied. So that is a really high number. I can't remember what the average is.
About 60%.
Yeah. So it's a much higher percentage of owner occupied in the rural district. So that's another kind of consideration for this district.
Mary, I just wanted to thank you and the staff in the first place for even getting this going, because you guys have been under the gun really without, a new director in place, Evan just coming on. So I appreciate all the work that you've put into this, and you as well, Med. So I think you'll all be fully staffed soon, but I wanted to throw that out there because we're making progress. But does anyone else have any other questions? Okay.
Thank you again. Sorry, I've just given this so much thought, and I have lots of questions, and I'm sure I'm going to have more as we go. So can you explain, or can you at least put it as like a note to come back with some information? I've heard Councillor Jones several times speak about our dead-end road policy, which I haven't personally read through, but I would like to get a copy of that at some point. When you have I'm going to use it, like you say, a 50-acre parcel of land, but it has very limited road frontage, what would the opportunities be for someone to develop housing with like a cul-de-sac situation? Does our dead-end road policy prohibit that? And
We'll get that information back to you, and
Okay.
I don't want to emote from memory, because
Okay.
it's been way too long since I've really dealt with these issues.
I just feel like as we start looking at what types of lots might be even developable with slope issues and wetland issues and lot sizes, that road frontage might play into what opportunities, if you have a large lot, but you have very limited road frontage, unless you run some sort of infrastructure into the lot, and we're able to develop lots throughout the lot, if that makes sense. I just don't know if we already have current policy that's going to prohibit that we might need to take a look at, or see how it could be, what the value is in that, so.
We might find as we move out of the zoning realm and into some of these other realms that there are some other issues that we'll have to take a look at
Okay.
related to regulations. I know sprinklers are one of them.
100%. I'm in a situation currently with a 3-unit building that is currently a 3-unit building. And I would like to change the occupancy of one of the units from residential to office. And the prohibiting factor is that we would have to sprinkle. So even moving to a less restrictive use. And it's, cost prohibitive. And when you're purchasing expensive property to then, do those types of accommodations. So I think that's also useful to look into.
Good questions. Mayor Hansel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So as you're all working along, I think you really need to keep in mind and think about the things that are likely going to have the biggest, most immediate impact. I mean, we've had that conservation cluster development on the books for a long, long time, and not one of them has been built, to my knowledge.
Do have an application.
We have an application, but it's 10 plus years later? And the reason is, from what I can tell, is we just don't have a lot of developers here locally that are in a position to take something like that on. And if you're gonna bring someone in from outside, they're not gonna come in just because we have that as an opportunity. They're gonna come in to do a development, and then they're gonna make what they have fit into your regulations. So if you ask me, like, the biggest thing we can do is take a look at that 5-acre zoning. Because as soon as you relax that 5-acre zoning, that's 1,000 plus parcels and different individuals that all of a sudden have a new option. And there are very few places that can handle a cluster development like that in the city. I mean, literally, you could probably spend an hour and call the owner of every single one that could possibly do that in one day. But I don't see a lot of gold in them hills, just based on my experience talking to developers and stuff like that. I think the larger parcels we have some significant obstacles to development that need to be worked through. They're workable, but don't spend a ton of time on that. If we can put before the council a serious discussion about relaxing that 5-acre zoning requirement, which the city of Keene historically had and subsequently saw a lot of development, let's do that as quickly as possible. I don't want to talk about this for a year. We need to put it in front of the community, put it in front of the council as soon as we can. Thank you.
Well, I agree. I do. Does anyone else have any other questions? I keep forgetting you're there. I'm sorry, Councilor Remy.
No worries at all. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm largely going to echo what Mayor Hansel just said. I don't think that the right ways for us to increase development and help us solve the housing crisis is to put half of the available developable land into a protected status. If we have those larger pieces, I'd rather see a larger development go on there. And I do appreciate our green space. I love the availability of green space, but I don't think we're going to have a mad dash of developing all of it. We have a lot of land already in conservation here. So I really think that moving to 2-acre zoning would be a great step in the right direction of being able to push those forward, but that's just one of the ways we can get there. Thank you.
You're welcome. Does anyone else have any comments?
I had a
Council.
question. Oh,
Yes.
I had a question way back. Did I understand correctly that they were going to build, if you had a 2-story building, and then they were going to build these newer parts onto that 2-story building? Is that what I understood?
If you're referring to the proposed changes to the Commerce District, Yes, that was one of the scenarios that we were trying to anticipate. I'm not sure if that's actually something that we would see. We just wanted to have that option in there in case someone wanted to do that. I have talked to one developer who has a building in a different part of town that's looking at doing that sort of thing, where they have an existing building that I believe is 2 stories, and they're thinking about potentially increasing the height to maybe 4 or 5 stories. It's in a different district than the Commerce District. And so in that instance, they were proposing or they're thinking about having it be set back further from the road than the actual 2-story portion of the building. So that's kind of where the idea sort of originated.
continue? I'll just say my concern. Are we sure that the 2 stories that are already there are strong enough and protective enough for something new? Because I hate to see happen to us what happened in Florida. You know, the middle part caved out on some of these buildings. So that would be something that I'm sure, I would hope a developer would be very aware of.
Yes, for sure. And that would be something that we would look at in the building permit process. That would be reviewed, the structural integrity of the building, and they would have to demonstrate that the building, you know, that what they're proposing is something that's structurally sound and safe.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Counselor. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, thank you both very much.
It's exciting.
So the next thing on the agenda is there's a joint PB and PLD meeting in June, on June 13th. Is that right, Mary?
Yes, that's your next regularly scheduled meeting. So if you have any business, that's when the meeting will be held. At the moment, we don't have anything
Okay.
planned, but if we do, we'll email you.
So there's a possibility it'll be canceled and you'll notify us?
Yes, yep, we'll notify you either way.
Okay, all right, thank you. I'll now adjourn the meeting and at 7:39. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.